I'm going to talk about how wars in the past have reshaped world orders in different directions. Much of what I have to say in terms of the ideas come out of a project that I've been part of for the past 4 years at Princeton University, headed by John Eikenberry, which brings together a number of historians, political scientists, historical sociologists, philosophers, and others to talk about world orders in a very broad sense. And I've learned a lot from John and from that project. Let me define to begin with what I mean by world order. So I simply mean how states align themselves in relation to the main powers. And this is not just about strategy and politics, it's also about economics, about values, and about ideas. So it's a much broader framework than what political scientists would sometimes refer to as international systems or international society. And I started in 1870 for reasons I think most of you would have guessed already. 1870 is the moment where you have new challenges rising within the global frameworks, first and foremost Germany in Europe and Japan in East Asia. And at the same time, you have the beginning of what is generally a little bit incorrectly referred to as new imperialism, meaning that the established imperialist states and the new competitors started a rather frenzied expansion towards the end of the century, first and foremost in Africa and the Middle East, but for Japan, of course, also in continental East Asia. So this framework of change is something that, to me, set up the overall changes that you see then taking place in the 20th century. I think it would be very hard to argue that without these fundamental changes in the late 19th century, that the past century would have looked anything like the way it ended up looking. Now, I think since the beginning of that transformation, so since the late 19th century, we've had 4 major reorderings connected to wars. 1914, First World War, not surprising. 1939, the Second World War. 1950, the Korean War. And probably also 2022, the war in Ukraine. So I'm going to argue why I think this is the case and why we for many different reasons, would see these wars as major reordering moments in terms of world order. So before I go into each of these and look at what I see as the reordering element in each of these cases, just a quick note on why these particular wars. If you look at all 4 of them, they're certainly not the biggest. The 2 first ones certainly were, but not the latter ones. In World War I, we lost slightly less than 20 million, according to the most recent estimate, 20 million people who perished. In the Second World War, the latest estimates that I have seen is around 55 million or thereabouts. In Korea, about 3 million, which is bad enough, but much less than what we have seen in the global wars. And in Ukraine, now slightly less than 200,000, at least according to US estimates. But of course, that's an ongoing conflict, and we don't know where it's going to end and what the disastrous results of this could be in the longer run. So this is not about the numbers of people who perish as a result of the wars. Neither is it about the ones that necessarily have had the biggest impact everywhere. So the argument here is not about wars that have transformed whole regions. There are a number of those, as you will know, in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, and elsewhere. These have been important wars, but they haven't had the kind of global reordering effect of, as the 4 that I'll be talking most about today have had. In part because of the involvement of major powers in the 4 cases that I'm looking at. And I'll explain that a little bit further later on. So in the case of World War I, the key reordering aspects to me is first and foremost how both the United States and Japan, in slightly different forms, break through as global powers. And part of this, particularly in the US case, of course, have to do with developments that have been going on for quite some time, particularly in economic terms. I won't have time to go into those today. For Japan, it was slightly different. Japan's rise was much more rapid, but it was undertaken in a setting where more traditional imperial powers, think Russia and China, and for that matter, Britain, were weakened in the area that Japan wanted to expand into. And Japan's ability to take on that reordering function, which it indeed got within the larger Eastern Asia region, was built, as in many of the cases that we're going to look at later on, not just on its own rising power, but also on the relative weakness of others. And as John Eikenberry, among others, remind us of, this is one of the things that you have to take into consideration when you look at reordering moments. It's not just about the rising power of powers, it's also about the weakness of others. And at times that is more important than the ones that seem to be on the rise. The second main reordering effect that the First World War had was that it bankrupted many of the European empires. Even though much of their expansion, think Middle East here, a very topical issue for today, much of their expansion actually continued into the interwar period. So you could almost talk about kind of double bankruptcy, as some historians have done recently, where the war itself exhausted France and Britain, but also that both of them took on, which is not untypical, I would argue, for major powers that are in decline, took on new duties, new possessions that ended up by exhausting them even more. Think Palestine, for instance, or Syria in this particular context. And then thirdly and finally, with regard to the First World War as a reordering moment, the war gave enormous emphasis and strength to anti-imperial movements in different parts of the world. And my colleague Eris Manella at Harvard and others have written about this in what he calls the Wilsonian moment, which is a very narrow way of explaining this. But the position taken by the United States under Woodrow Wilson did play a role in this. Much more important, in my view, is what came from below, is how many of these movements, from Korea to the Middle East to South Africa to the Caribbean, started understanding that the kind of imperialism that they had been facing now was in the process of exhausting itself. They understood that, I think, much earlier than the self-realization started to come into the main European powers, that they were heading in a direction that would be highly problematic. So that's the key issues with regard to World War I. The breakthrough from the United States and Japan, the exhaustion of European empires, and the rise in anti-imperial resistance. For the Second World War, I think people like D.C. Watt and others have it right when they, in a way, see these two reordering wars as being closely connected, but where the results are not necessarily the same, or even predictable, I guess. Donald Watt would argue from one to the other. What the Second World War did was that it basically ended the European world order that had been in existence since the beginning of the 19th century. Some people argue even longer, but in the work that I'm doing at the moment, which centers very much on the mid-19th century, I would argue that the full-fledged European order really came into being after the Napoleonic Wars, at the beginning of the 19th century. The Second World War ended that order and transferred it to the European offshoots, to the United States and the Soviet Union, which was not the same thing as a continued European domination, though, of course, closely connected to what had taken place before. As I've argued in the global Cold War and elsewhere, There are direct lines between European imperialism and colonialism leading over to the Cold War. But the former is not enough to explain the latter. So the kind of ideological aspects that drove the Cold War came out specifically of these two societies and these two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, which transformed the world order that they represented over what had gone before. And then secondly, in a continuation also of some of the trends seen with regard to the First World War, the Second World War created the post-colonial world. It created the countries that are now increasingly becoming predominant within the global order, China and India, but also a lot of other post-colonial countries, quite gradually in some cases, more quickly in others, that came to prominence after the Second World War ended. Now, some people have tried in a sort of counterfactual manner to argue, wouldn't this have happened anyway, even if it were not for a global war right in the middle of the 20th century? I find that, I mean, as with most hypotheticals, I find it very difficult to have a meaningful position with regard to this. I don't see many trends that would point in the direction of the kind of rapid decolonization and the existence of new post-colonial entities if it hadn't been for the war. I think the war was preeminent in terms of explanations for why this transformation took place. Some people wonder then why I put the Korean War in as one of these reordering moments. If I also argue that the kind of division of the world, as Wilfrid Lord has called it, was created by the Second World War. And there are several reasons which point directly up to today why I think the Korean War was another of these reordering moments. The first one was that it led to a militarization of the Cold War, which it would have been very difficult to foresee, in my view, coming out of the Second World War or even the conflicts over positions in Europe in the late 1940s. It led to a perception, both by the United States and the Soviet Union, that this was a full-fledged military conflict, even though the two superpowers, as we used to refer to them, were not directly at war with each other. And there is a tremendous difference in terms of world orders, which is an important point for today, I think, between rivalry and conflict between great powers, think United States and China, and the kind of highly militarized Cold War scenario that we got after the outbreak of the Korean War. Some people, of course, argue today that we might be heading in that direction. I was just down in Washington last week and argued the opposite, that there is no necessity in that over-militarization of the US-China relationship along the lines of what happened with the Korean War for the Cold War. Then secondly, with regard to the Korean War, and equally important, it was the Korean War that led to the setting up of the kind of nuclear order that we have seen all the way since the 1950s. It led to an intensification of the reliance in strategic terms of both superpowers on nuclear weapons for overall deterrence. And it also led to a much more intense research and development phase for nuclear weapons of different kinds, as many in this audience will know, that came to symbolize the kind of Cold War world order that we saw in the latter part of the 20th century. The Korean War also enforced what I have called strict bipolarity within the world order. So by that, as I've argued in a more recent book on the Cold War, there were really only two alternatives available, particularly for new states that wanted to orient themselves with regard to this post-Korean War world order. And these two were mutually exclusive. It was very difficult. Many countries tried to maneuver in between these two. Some succeeded for a while, but not a single country were able to break away from the bipolarity of the Cold War order entirely, until that order itself started to crumble during the 1980s. And that's important, I think, for understanding how this particular world order actually worked and how it was distinctive from many of the other world orders that we have been discussing. And then, of course, there were a whole set of conflicts outside of Europe that took place during the globalized and highly militarized period of the Cold War. Besides Korea itself, of course, in the Middle East, you had Vietnam, you had Taiwan, twice you had Angola, Ethiopia in the 1970s, and then, of course, Afghanistan. These were significant wars and conflicts, but within the world order that had already been established. None of them seemed to me to threaten to overthrow or basically change that world order, at least until we get to the very tail end of the Cold War international system itself, where I think it might be reasonable to say that the wars in Afghanistan played some of that kind of role. They're not close, in my view, to the kind of role that the war in Ukraine is playing for our own time. So before moving on to that war, before moving on to Ukraine, it's also, of course, incredibly important here to note in world order terms that there was a peaceful end to the Cold War. Right? So in spite of the high degree of militarization, the high degree of intense bipolarity, the Cold War still ended reasonably, if you think about it on a global scale, peacefully. Which to me says something about the fundamental aspects of world order as you move into the latter part of the 20th century, about the significance of economic change, about the significance of the existence of nuclear weapons, without any doubt, from the people, again, in the audience who have written about this. But also, maybe first and foremost, in terms of how the Cold War international system ended, the emphasis on domestic and internal change, which was, to me, what brought about the end of that particular world order. First and foremost, in the Soviet Union, but also globally to a much higher degree, I think, than has often been noted. These changes away from collective solutions, away from solutions that emphasized socialism in its various forms and planning in its various forms, had started well before the Cold War as an international system got into trouble, but then sped up during the late 1970s and 1980s, influencing on a global scale the way in which the Cold War ended. Not as any kind of necessity in terms of how markets and finance took over the world, but as a direct product of what was taking place during that particular moment in time. So we again come back to this issue of, the relative positions matter, but also the timing matters overall. Not all of these issues are connected to each other, as I remember arguing last time I spoke in the august hall that I now see in front of me. There are connections, but they are not determining connections between these different kinds of change. Which then leads me to the war in Ukraine. And some of you might be surprised that I highlight that as another reordering moment on a global scale. And I'll try to explain why I see that as being so. The first reason is that the war in Ukraine has massively hastened Russia's decline as a great power. It hasn't ended it, and it didn't create it. This general decline for Russia had been underway for a very long time, probably ever since the Cold War ended. But it certainly hastened it. And the fact that Russia has been unable to reach its military aims in Ukraine has highlighted its impotence, really, with regard to its neighboring regions as well, which, of course, everyone in Norway will know is not the same thing as not being able to destroy things, which the Russians in this case have proven themselves quite good at. But it's a difference between that and reaching one's political and military aims, and that Russia has manifestly failed to do. The war in Ukraine has also strengthened the military ties between Europe and North America. We don't know how this is going to play itself out, and this would be an interesting point for discussion with the audience. We don't know what kind of form this is going to take in the future. My own guess is that it would actually take a form that is somewhat different from what we have seen in NATO up to now. I think for various reasons, many of them connected to the country in which I'm in now, there will be more emphasis on the European axis, the European part of the NATO alliance going forward. But be that as it may, there's no doubt that the war in Ukraine has strengthened military ties between Europe and North America in a way that would have been hard to foresee before the war started. And that's, of course, really important when we think about world orders going forward. Not necessarily decisive, but very important. The main effect, I would argue, of this war is that it has fast-tracked our road towards a much more multipolar world overall. A world in which the reach of US influence, the United States having been by far the most significant great power since the Cold War ended, where the reach of US influence has been shown to be significantly reduced. Even China's position, which in reality has been to support Russia in the war in Ukraine, has proven itself to be limited in terms of being able to get other countries to do what China, as a major economic power globally, has wanted them to do. And I have a strong suspicion that when we look back at this war in a decade or 2 decades, not only will we see the trend towards multipolarity as one of the key aspects of how the war has developed, we will probably see it as a watershed in terms of how countries outside of the traditional great powers position themselves in terms of their understanding of world order. It has been fascinating to see how other major countries have taken fully independent positions on the war in Ukraine. India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. And perhaps most importantly, I think the latter two. So the only two fully fledged peace plans for Ukraine that have been presented by South Africa and Indonesia. Now, if you would get any sense of how the world is changing under our feet with regard to this particular war, that I think would be it. Right? It reminds me a little bit, I think, of the reordering that has gone on in connection with and after the other major wars that we've talked about this afternoon. Not immediately easy to see in coming out of the war in terms of its military results, because sometimes the military results are somewhat different from what the long-term effects end up being coming out of each of these wars. But when you talk about war and world order in a broader sense, I think it's particularly important to try to think about these reordering aspects. Because if you don't get that, wars simply become, as other people who are here today use Ron and others have argued, simply about the military effects of what goes on. That's not unimportant. You have to get that right in terms of understanding. But the long-term effects are sometimes different than that. They sometimes point in very different directions. So that's my overall argument for you today. We have to understand wars for what they bring themselves, the kind of destruction and the kind of human despair that wars bring. But we also have to understand them as reordering moments for a much longer period of time than the wars themselves last. Thank you.
Thank you, Arne. So we have time for questions and discussion.
Thank you for a splendid lecture. You made the argument, I think, initially that the only reorderings from 1870 to the present would have been taking place in the context of wars. But then, if I understood you right in the course of your lecture, you did see the end of the Cold War as a major transition point or turning point. So I'm not fully able to square that circle. So that's one question, if you can help me figure that out, because in my book, still the end of the Cold War is a phase of major global reordering. And my second question is about the last part of your lectures, where you talk about the war in Ukraine and the impact of that on global order. And I sympathize fully with your claim that this is a moment of multipolarization, as it were. But I do wonder whether it isn't the war in Ukraine that, in a sense, both crystallizes and exacerbates processes that have actually been underway for quite a long time, rather than that releasing a multipolarization as a process as such. So those are my two questions. But otherwise, thanks again. Great lecture.
Thank you. Both of those are great questions. On the former, I don't think I would argue that it's only wars, and certainly not only these wars, that have set about significant reordering. I think wars concentrate reordering moments in a more direct and immediate way, connecting to your second question, than what any other kind of events do. But I would not argue that they're the only ones that lead to broad structural change, which is the reason why I mentioned the way the Cold War ended. I do think, however, and I think we see some consequences of that form of thinking today, that we sometimes believe that both the way the Cold War ended and the results with which the Cold War ended were more significant in terms of understanding the total history of the 20th century than there is reason to believe. And I say this as an historian who spent much of my career studying the Cold War, including how the Cold War ended. So I think we have to be careful with that. I'm not saying that because the Cold War did not end up being a hot war, as if hot wars would make everything more explicable than the kind of peaceful reorderings. That's not the point. The point is rather that some of the structures, it seems to me, that came to predominate the generation or so that we've now seen after the Cold War ended, did not quite go away with the end of the Cold War itself. We see that now with regard to Russia, we see it with regard to China, we see it maybe first and foremost with regard to the United States. But very little changed, at least initially, in terms of America's approach to the world from 1989 to 1991. So that's for the first question. The second question is very important, and it's important here to make clear my own views. So obviously, there are structural changes and realignments taking place that very often have their origins well before the wars that I've been pointing to as the reordering moments. When I say moments, I mean exactly that, moments. They come out of processes, all of them. The wars themselves, the outbreak of these wars, but also the structural changes that take place within them and in their immediate aftermath, that have their roots in a much earlier time period than the wars themselves. So in that sense, I'm an unabashed structuralist. I have no problem with seeing these long-term trends as pointing in certain directions. But I would also say, and this is perhaps one of the most significant aspects of the study of wars that we have, I think, moved closer to in our own time, that how the wars themselves unfold in terms of military action first and foremost, but also in terms of larger changes, maybe as Paul Kennedy has argued, first and foremost in economic terms, that itself also plays a role. Structure doesn't mean here that the developments before these war break out are given. The wars themselves also play a significant role in terms of the aftermath, the kind of reordering that I'm talking about. So absolutely with you with regard to structure, but structure certainly in these cases should be more understood as trends and certainly do not explain everything.
Hugh.
Can I also ask two questions? The first question is a China question about your 2022 moment. You obviously, you mentioned China's power as being limited, and I absolutely take that point. The question is much more about what the economic implications of this reordering are when you talk about the growth of a multilateral order, of a breakdown of a more centralized, if that's the right word, system. And that is the problem for states that find themselves militarily drawn to the United States and economically drawn to China, and the way, therefore, in which those forms of power are diverging rather than converging, which actually makes order very difficult. I mean, I think in the 1945 moment, the US has basically done very well economically out of the war as well as militarily and strategically. Just as in 1815, Britain came out far stronger in many respects after the war. So that's my first question. And my second, if I'm allowed one, is the whole question of great powers. The presumption that great powers are making the order, and whether that leaves too much out of account. I mean, maybe the inevitable answer to that has to be yes, but I'm thinking here of the capacity of small powers to tweak the tails of great powers, the place of alliances, the argument that essentially great powers find themselves drawn into these wars for what seem to be, in inverted commas, trivial reasons, whether it's Serbia or Belgium in 1914, whether it is Poland or in 1939, that argument that actually they don't quite have the control that they think they might have, and the order therefore is more friable than they might imagine it to be.
Thanks, Hugh. Those are again very, very good questions. I mean, on the former one is perhaps the one that is the most difficult in all of this. I agree with you fully that for many countries, many regions of the world, feel increasingly, and of course this has been highlighted by some of the effects of the Ukraine war itself, particularly in terms of supplies, both of food and technology on a global scale, that they are put under pressure in different directions by the United States and China, first and foremost. They also put under pressure by others, I think Turkey and various other actors that are involved in this. But first and foremost, the United States and China, where the United States emphasis seemed to be increasingly on the security side and China on the economic side. I think this will be a very difficult terrain to maneuver for many countries and many parts of the world, including Europe. I don't think it is going to go away anytime soon. I don't see bipolarity in it, but I do see powerful great powers that almost operate in different scales with regard to how they approach the rest of the world. And I can't, maybe you can't, you or others in the audience, but I can't think of a moment that is quite like that, right? In terms of how dominant great powers approach the making of world order. I don't have any predictions about where that would lead. I mean, people who have written about it have said opposite things. I mean, some say this makes a lasting and durable conflict between China and the United States less likely because they almost operate in different dimensions. But I think the majority view, certainly in this country, is that it could easily intensify conflict and rivalry. Because of the different dimensions in which the two operate. And they do not see the world in the same terms, neither do those who are in need of assistance from both. Right. Then on the second question, now that one depends, of course, very much on how you define within our current emerging world order what great power actually means, right? All the countries that I mentioned at the end of my talk, emerging or fully emerged, I think in the case of India, great powers that should be understood as such in terms of what they are capable of doing. To me, it helps to think in regional terms, because I have the strong suspicion that the world is not only becoming more multipolar, I think it's also becoming more regional in many ways. And I think the predominance that countries such as India or Brazil would have within their respective regions is going to be a very determining aspect of how they are able to behave within the emerging world order as such. I wouldn't be surprised at all if, a decade, half a generation from now, we will not only find a more regionalized world, but we will find great powers that are much more predominant within those regions than what we are seeing today.
In the back here.
Thank you very much. When you talk about orders, it seems to me that orders only consist of nation states, but you don't mention institutions, global or regional international institutions. So does this mean that you don't think they are important, or what is the reason for leaving them out? You can, of course, say that global institutions like the League or more the United Nations are not that important, perhaps, but you have regional institutions that may be absolutely important. For example, in Europe, European Union, for example. So wouldn't that also belong to the order, the political order of the world and regions? Thank you.
Yes, I think they do, but more as products of a certain kind of world order than the instigator, creator of these. I mean, this might change over time. If you think about European Union, for instance, I think it is now at a point where much of the European regionalism, if you can call it that, in a global sense, will actually happen through the EU rather than through the individual states. But I would still argue that in terms of creating, and we see this very clearly with Ukraine, creating these reordering moments, it is still states, individual states, that have the most significant role to play. That in a way legitimize these orders, even though they are then expressed through international or regional institutions. So that's not devaluating the significance of international institutions, but it's understanding their role, understanding the position that they have overall with regard to reordering. I don't think there is much with the current reordering moment, if I'm right about that, the war in Ukraine, that leads me to think otherwise about the role of multilateral or regional, even global institutions. They have a very, very important role to play, not least on issues of peace and war, on issues that have to do with economic cooperation, economic orders on a global scale. But they do not by themselves create these kinds of reordering moments or new frameworks.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting introduction. With regard to the world order and developments in the world order, should we not also be thinking of what's going on with regard to a new space race and the constellations that are being formed geographically? I'm thinking here of developments in with cooperation between Russia and China and involving India also in the same campus. And then we have other developments with Japan on the west, and even space stations forming to put flags down on what part of the moon can be used by different countries. Developments have come very far, but you don't hear very much about it. I'm just wondering whether this is totally irrelevant to this discussion or whether it plays in your future scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a good question. I think it's very clear from what we see today that much of the competition that goes into the future will take place outside of the frameworks that had been established at the end of the Cold War and the immediate aftermath. And the space dimension is certainly one of those that come out. There are a number of dimensions that we have to get used to being part of the kind of reordering that I've been talking about today. In space, and especially, as you pointed out very correctly, cooperation with regard to various forms of space exploration will be of great significance. And we see trends already that go in the direction of increasing cooperation on these issues according to where your perceived friends are within the world order that we now see emerging, as you pointed out in the question. There are many other dimensions as well. The dimensions that have to do with the environment in a global setting are parts of these. Those that have to do with human disasters of various kinds, including pandemic disasters. What I've seen over the past sort of decade, maybe a bit less than a decade, with regard to this, does not give me great hope for the future with regard to these essential issues. Because it seems to me that very different from what many of us, myself included, thought when the Cold War ended, and in the first decade and a half after that event, was that it would provide more room, whatever you thought of it as a lasting reordering moment, it provided more room for cooperation on essential, vital, existential issues for all of us between great powers that rivaled on a number of other issues. And we haven't seen very much of that. We have rather seen the opposite. On issues from space to medicine, we have seen the world heading in directions where the predominant great powers first and foremost look at the strategic value to them of what is going on and how that can be exploited in the future, rather than broader international cooperation, which, in my view, of course, would best be done through international organizations and institutions. So we'd rather see a trend away from that rather than towards it, which is, of course, really frightening when we think about how existential these challenges will be in the, not just in the deeper future, but in the immediate future.
Any other questions? Take a moment to look around you.
I don't want to end on an entirely pessimistic note. I mean, that was sort of a gloom into all of this. Let me just make one point, and then we can see if there are other questions. One point that points in a somewhat more hopeful direction, and that is in terms of the understanding that has come out, the need for global developments in economic terms that are more just and certainly more equally integrated than what had been the case up to now, which has been demonstrated by the effects for the global south of the war in Ukraine. On this, I am actually a little bit more hopeful than I was only a few years ago. I do think that the kind of pressure that we will see with regard to establishing the possibilities for taking the global responsibility for world food supplies more seriously than what has been the case before this war ended, that is now before us. I'm not sure if the world will be capable of grasping that opportunity, but I think given the understanding of this that have come out of the Ukraine conflict, from a number of countries, from South America to Africa to South Asia, I think there will be tremendous pressure towards putting in place systems of distribution in terms of avoiding the more negative effects of global conflict that simply didn't exist before the more recent war in Ukraine, the 2022 war in Ukraine broke out. So if you're looking for a silver lining, and of course, since the majority here are Norwegians, I guess everyone would be looking for a silver lining. That's perhaps the one that I see the most coming out of this. It might not be much, but if you sit in a country that is entirely dependent on wheat imports from Russia or Ukraine and getting very little, more concentration on that issue does have a positive effect.
Very good. Okay, so I think we should thank Arne Westad again for an excellent lecture.
Thank you.